geluba naqdogliyo nugal waa ku darara melay nabadi joogta.
Welcome to ISIRKA. My name's Amina Isir, and join me as I take you on a journey to explore identity, culture, and belonging. Take a seat as I take you through time, space, and various perspectives of cultural identity. Stay tuned to see where the journey will take us today. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of ISIRKA. So this episode is part one of a conversation that I had with Kasim Wise. And so in this conversation, we talk a little bit about his first documentary and the fashion film, and then his experience of screening the documentary back home in Somaliland. And so then in the next episode, that will be focusing more on his second documentary that he recently screened at London Somali Week. And we'll talk a little bit more about us meeting in London and how Somali Week was overall. So enjoy this conversation and stay tuned for more from ISIRKA. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of ISIRKA. This episode features Kasim Wise, a documentary filmmaker, an artist, a content creator. So this episode will also be a part of the London series. Kasim and I met in London this past fall, and he also screened his most recent documentary, a part of London Somali Week. So we'll be talking to him a little bit more about all of those things, about the work that he does, about his engagement with Somaliland and what that looks like. So Kasim Wise, welcome to ISIRKA.
Thank you for inviting me. I've been watching, well, rather listening to ISIRKA podcast for a while, so to be actually a part of it is an absolute pleasure. So thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So basically, we had a previous conversation actually a couple of years ago, right after you launched your documentary. So before we even kind of talk about that, but we previously had a conversation about identity, culture, and belonging, and what that kind of looked like for you in terms of engagement with Somaliland from an advocacy level, as well as a personal level, but then also in the creative work that you choose to produce. So I guess this is like a couple years later version of that conversation. Before this documentary that you screened right now, there were two documentaries that kind of are, there was a documentary and then I guess a fashion film, right? Like that's how you kind of distinguish between the two, that you chose to put together to commemorate. I think it was in 2021. So we were still like kind of on the edges of lockdown, that you produced around Somaliland. So could you speak a little bit more about those two projects, the way you how that idea kind of came together, and how it was like for you working on that?
So it was honestly a spur of the moment project, to be completely honest. I didn't expect it to take off in the way that it did. So there was 2 days before 18 May, and I reached out to Haley, who I did the documentary with, and I just messaged her and I said to her, hey, look, we did a photo shoot together a few months prior. And so I reached out to her, and she wanted to also work on creative projects, more creative projects. So I reached out to her and I said to her, hey, 18 May is coming up, and I want to do a photo shoot commemorating different cities in Somaliland. And she said, oh, okay. She wasn't aware of the time limit that we had. And so she thought there's probably at least minimum a month. And I said, we've got 48 hours. She said immediately, she immediately said, this is not happening, mate. Like, you're crazy. And I said, no, we can do it. So then finally, after about 30 minutes of convincing her, and how it was ready, I said to her, look, I'll send you over a mood board, and then we'll crack on. So I sent it over to her. We minimized. So I wanted to do all 6 cities, but then I had to break it down to 3, so that it was just a bit more realistic and within that time frame. So we stuck to Hargeysa, Borao, and Borame, those 3 cities. And so I had to run over to Westfield and get some stuff that I needed. And then I ordered a bunch of stuff and they arrived the following day. And then I went to the studio. So thankfully the studio wasn't too far from where I lived. And that's also where Haley worked. So I went over there and then I was unpacking the suitcase. And then as we were doing that, she just took a couple of photos, and then she just asked me a bunch of questions. And then from that, she said, wait, let me just ask you a bunch of questions because this is really interesting. And then I just record it, and then let's just see how it goes. I was like, all right, cool. So we did. And then we just ended up shaping it to become a documentary. So then the following day ended up being 18 May. So what we released was the fashion film and the photo shoot. Those were the two that we released on the 18 May. And then in July, I think it was the 21st of July, we released the documentary. And then shortly after, we submitted it into a exhibition with Guap magazine and Construm Studio that ran throughout the month up until also, so it was between July, it ran through the months of July and August. And then, you know, that's how it originated. It was something that was the spur of the moment that ended up becoming something that was so incredibly powerful, that really resonated with a lot of people. And it's a project that is very, very dear to myself and Haley. And Haley always mentions that, she goes, oh, she sees that as her baby. She's worked on other projects, of course, as well since then, but she sees that one genuinely like as her baby. She's very protective of of that project. And it was an introduction to Somaliland. Yeah.
For her, or you think in general?
In general, I think definitely for her, but then also in general, I think for the wider public who weren't at the time familiar with Somaliland, it was a introduction to them. I think it highlighted Somaliland in a nice short way, that it kind of encompassed everything within that short film, in that short doc.
So when you were kind of like answering her questions, I feel like it's always like I have a lot of non-Somali friends that I talk to about Somali things, you know? And so it's interesting having an outsider's perspective, where like you don't take for granted that people know about the intricacies or the nuances of what you're talking about. It allows you to also look at things like with a fresh set of eyes. So when you and her were having that conversation, and then that kind of led to you working on this project, how did it feel for you to kind of put that, like, be responsible in some ways for putting information out there in a certain way?
When you're if you're creating a project that's about your life, there isn't that extra pressure because it's about you, right? But whereas if you're creating a project about somebody else, or you're creating about a country which obviously encompasses millions of people, there's a huge responsibility on you. And I definitely felt that pressure with the doc. But I also didn't want to pressure myself with going into the finer details of things, because again, we only had such a short time frame that it definitely wouldn't have done it justice for me to dive into so many different topics. So I wanted to keep it to something that was a soft introduction to the people, so it wasn't as pressurized as the new doc, which we'll dive into later on, which dived into so many different aspects of Somaliland and different journeys of different people who were also involved in who were in the documentary as well. It was very different. So there's always going to be a sense of responsibility to do justice to the story, but it just depends on how much of the story are you telling. So it was introduction, so it wasn't something where I was diving into very specific niche pieces of history. It was more broad. Does that make sense? It was a bit broad, so it wasn't as intense and as heavy as this doc, and as heavy as the next ones are going to be.
And so could we also kind of talk about the ways in which you chose, you combined like the fashion film part was a cool way of kind of bringing it to life. So you as like a general creative, like as an artist, how was that aspect of kind of bringing to life these different cities?
Surprisingly, it wasn't that difficult. The one that I thought was the most difficult definitely was Burqa. That's the one that I struggled with. I didn't struggle with Hargeysa, and I didn't struggle with Borami. The reason being, Hargeysa is known as the home of poets, Wahogi Funke Sugante. So all I needed to do was just depict that when I was representing Hargeysa. So that one wasn't too difficult. And then Borami is Hoiga Aqwanta, so it wasn't also difficult in depicting that as well. Whereas with Burqa, it was a little bit more difficult because it's Meshi Alenklikategi. Do you know what I mean? So how do I depict that? So what I did was I depicted it as a guy who's going to Bur'o with the flag to take it to hoist it up there, right? So obviously the island was created in Boromir, then it was taken over to Bur'o, and then it was hoisted up. So I was depicting that person who was in that transit, basically, from taking it from Boromir to Bur'o. That's how I chose to depict Bur'o. But it was a little bit more. If I feel like if you don't know that bit of history, you wouldn't make the connection as quickly as you would with Hargeysa and Boromir. So yeah, that one I would say was a little bit more of a challenge depicting. Probably the most challenging. It would probably be the most challenging out of all of them. I feel that, like Berbera would have been easy to do, Argabo would have been easy to say. Like, there's so many cities that would have been a lot easier. I think just Bura was just a little bit more difficult to depict. Or you could go with, Gobal Kiraga, and you can just, have a you can have a few guys, arm wrestling
Oh
or
my
something,
God.
you can something cliche.
That, I mean,
You
like,
know what
if
I
you
mean?
want to do.
So, or someone, wrestling Ligden or something.
The
Is
only
it
thing you were
Ligden, yeah?
missing, I guess, even with that, is also like, like the four fingers in somebody's face, like the pure, like, it just be aggression.
Oh,
That could actually be another way to do it.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, that was definitely a missed opportunity. Yeah, I'm gonna put that down somewhere. I'm taking that note.
They're gonna be like, oh yeah, they're really landers, yeah. But I think also with that one, you chose to. I'm looking at it now, the fashion
You know
film.
what about that fashion that jars me? I'll tell you actually, is I by mistake messed up my beard
Oh yeah, so
basically
yeah, you have no
a
facial
few days
hair.
before. So it's there's a little bit of facial hair, and so that was stressful because I was like, I don't want to look like, so yeah, I shaved off my facial hair by accident. And so that was that. Yeah,
That
that
makes you
that
look
was
extra,
a little bit of stress.
extra, like extra young.
Yeah, that's probably why I look even younger. Yeah.
So how did people, when you dropped the fashion film? So it's also like, all right, let's go into this. You were born and raised in the UK, Somaha.
It always, I find that so mad that I never thought in a million years that where I was born was ever going to become this controversial. Well, not I wouldn't say controversial, but up for debate to say, no, you weren't born in the UK. You came straight from Bro. Like
Not even
it's
Hargeysa,
wild,
yeah. Not even
But
Iraka, okay.
not even like, straight from Bro. Yeah, straight from Bro. But yeah, no, I was born in the UK.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
I was born specifically in
we
Sheffield.
could quickly touch on that real quick because
Yeah.
that's a conversation that people have with me, and I don't even try to speak Somali publicly, okay, or in general. So I think that there is like this general connotation, and that's part of the reason why I asked that is because I was going to lead it into my question about the fact that you were born and raised in the UK, but you chose to kind of have your creative projects or the work that you do creatively focus on some like your ethnic background, where you come from, and your culture. And I think that there is why a lot of people have issues with that, because that's a conversation that I have with a lot of people too, like even about like my interest in Somali music. They're like, oh well, you were born back home, right? I think and I'm like, no, I was born in America. And it's kind of like they just assume that there's a big assumption generally that a lot of cultural work is just happening by people that were only like born and raised within that context, or born within that context, or have certain claims. But I think it's also because we're a relatively new diaspora community, and I think there's also gatekeeping and politicking alongside that. But I think as our generation gets older, like the generation that was born in the diaspora, then there will be more people that might do kind of cultural work to kind of shift that narrative. But what is that conversation like for you? Is it always like you're just like, well, yeah, how does that conversation go with you?
Yeah, no, sometimes, I mean, it depends. Sometimes you think to yourself, do I look like a fob? Like, what's going on here? Well, I want, well, like, So sometimes you just look at it a bit like, well, what's going on here? You start thinking of different things, but it was never the case when I was younger. Even though even then I used to speak good Somali, it just happened as I got older, and I think it's because I physically obviously look older now. It's not like I'm, this 15-year-old anymore, so it's easier to now say, oh, were you born in Watanki? What I will never get used to is a 70-year-old person saying walal to me, someone that is, older than my parents, or someone as old as my parents or something, saying walal and stuff, and being offended when I say other, or, or habarir and stuff, that to me I've realized I've got to that state, to that age now, because I remember as a kid, it was a thing where people that were in their 20s were complaining about that. Saying, oh, why these people? What's wrong with these people? They just make the conversations really awkward because you can't, I'm experienced now. Now it's like, yes, it's just a bit mad. I don't know what to say. I'm like, how about it? What? Yeah, you're literally stuttering as you try to respond back to them. But I take it also at the same time as a compliment, because it means that my Somali is really good. And I've worked hard in doing that. And when I say I've worked hard, it wasn't that I've done sessions, or I've taken a pen and paper together to study or anything like that, but it was just that as a child watching Ruwayadaha, and we didn't necessarily listen to music because we weren't allowed as kids to listen to music and stuff, but watching Yaraha, the videos that were sent to us, of weddings and things like that, just watching it, and then also making sure that I don't only speak Somali well, but that I also don't have an accent, because that's the thing as well. You can speak Somali really well, but then if you have a say Wallahi accent, it's not exactly the same. So I also made sure that I perfected my pronunciations as well. And so now when people say, they think that I'm born, I wear it as a badge of honor. And I think it's dope to be. No, I think it's dope to be able to also, if I had an option like, oh, you're born in, Brau, or wherever else in Somaliland, I think that's cool. Mahali there, as long as obviously that I came as a kid and I managed to integrate into society over here properly and stuff like that, and that I'm not as an adult trying to navigate this Western world, that would be a struggle.
Yeah.
But I take it as a compliment.
I think then that also kind of it's a way of like legitimizing your connection, like even if it wasn't like you started from like being born there and then coming here, like this work and the extra effort to also be connected is another way of legitimizing your connection.
But one thing I will say is I definitely taught myself how to read and write Somali. When I used to try read Somali as a kid, I was like, ja, ja, ga, ga. It wasn't, now I can just read it more or less fluently and write it fluently. And that definitely came from practice of trying, reading posts on Facebook or Twitter or wherever it may be, that's in Somali, reading it, and then reading the comments, and then typing it and spelling it out, and then eventually after you do that, you do it long enough, you perfect it, and you're able to then do it properly, as well.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, when you dropped the fashion film, so outside of that general like kind of conversation about where you're from, how did people respond to it?
It was, the people responded to it really well, and funnily enough, because I thought, look, this was a Somali guy with long hair. I don't know how this was gonna go, and especially with Landers, were very, very critical of there of people in general. And if you get the check of approval by Landers, that means that you've got the source. In my opinion, because they always say if you can't make it in Hargeysa, you go somewhere else, basically. And when I released it and it was received so well across the board back home in the West, wherever people where Somalis were, specifically Somalilanders were, it was received really well. And for me, that just gave me the motivation to say, all right, keep going forward. You're doing something special. You're doing something different, which is something different. But then also there's a big responsibility that comes with it. So I'm aware of that as well. And it's heavy. That old saying where they say, as corny as it may be, heavy is the head that wears the crown, something like that. But yeah, no, it is. And, I come across people who I would meet, that have seen the documentary or seen my other posts and stuff like that would come up to me in person and say, oh, Kasim, you're doing really great with this, or you've got to do this, you've got to do that. They expect so much. And it's great for people to expect that, but then you also feel the pressure. You're like, okay, I've started something here. I can't just, abandon it up and just be like, all right, that was an experience. Now on to the next thing. Do you know what I mean? You've got an actual responsibility, and you've realized that this is a niche and no one else is doing it. So you kind of have a responsibility.
Okay, so speaking of the niche, what exactly are you referring to?
Oh, well, the niche is many different things. So, um, in terms of the documentary, creating documentaries about Somaliland, and obviously I'm not the first person who's done it, and I'm not going to be the last person to do it either. And I always encourage people to do more documentaries about Somaliland from different perspectives, and just different perspectives. But the niche being someone born and raised in the diaspora, who's really dedicated in getting out Somaliland's story and Somaliland's history, and not just through a sit down, but with industry production and industry standard productions. It's not something that's really done, so that is a niche within itself. And I want to see more people doing it, and there's that message in both of the documentaries where I say that I encourage Somalilanders to start creating documentaries, more documentaries, film, and just anything, But I mean, we excel in writing books and releasing books and poetry, sure, but we also need to start doing something more visual in the sense of documentaries or films to tell the stories as well. So that is the niche. That's the niche that I'm referring to. But then also, with my podcast that I'm going to be getting back to on YouTube, you see many podcasts that are Somali, right? But you don't see many Somalis doing podcasts from the diaspora that are doing it in Somali as well. You would see it in English, they would release it in English, or you would have people back home who are doing podcasts, but they're doing it in Somali, or they're doing it in Afghanistan if it's over here in the diaspora, but you're not seeing someone born and raised in the diaspora that's having those conversations, and interesting conversations and much needed conversations in Somali on a podcast. So that within itself is also a different niche. So yeah, it's just many, many niches, I guess, that I'm tapping into.
Mm-hmm. Did I already ask you how people responded to your films? I already did, right?
Yeah, they basically said "Shagara."
Oh, I was you held off for 24 whole minutes, but it was inevitable to drop at some point. Like I keep talking about the fashion film, but then the documentary also came out. And then when you did both those projects, the fashion film and the documentary in 2021, before you went back to Somaliland as an adult. Yes. Although you are this person who's definitely kind of created this connection of sorts to your culture, your ethnic background, it's a different thing to also then go back as an adult. You went as a kid. We had a conversation about that, about your time in Somaliland. And honestly, I think we talked a bit about that too, about what it was going to be like when you actually went. And I was like, you'll see, like you had a lot of ideals of what it was going to be. And I think overall, it seems like it was pretty okay for you. But so how was it like going back after you did these documentaries? You have a little bit of social media buzz. People recognize your hair, your face. How was it going back?
It was it was insane because as soon as we came, because when I went as a kid, we came from we landed in Berbera, right? Berbera Airport. I think at the time Hargeysa Airport was closed or under construction, or I'm not sure, but everyone was landing from Berbera. So this time we came through Hargeysa, and that was the first time landing in through Hargeysa, and then coming out of the airport, coming into the main city, just as we're leaving the airport, just smelling the burning of coal. Honestly, that's when I realized I'm home. When I got off the airport, I didn't feel it as much. But as soon as I smelt the coal, the burning coal, and that's when I immediately said, I'm home. That's when it felt like I was home. Yeah. So it was great. And then, I never expected as soon as I came I stayed in a hotel called Mamusan. I never expected, Askar Dan coming to the gate, standing in a line and saluting me as I come. That is
Why
wild.
did he recognize you? or like what was the context behind this?
But I don't know. It was so bizarre, and I was just, it's one of those things. Would you even like? You're not expecting that. I didn't expect when I went back home. It's so funny. I never really expect people to recognize me, regardless of where I go. And every time it happens, I act like I'm surprised. Like, I mean, I generally kind of am, and I'm like, oh, well, okay, where you know from? And they're like, TikTok, and you're like, oh, YouTube, and you're like, oh yeah, like as if I don't have social platforms and videos that were going viral and stuff. So I don't know. But then when I was leaving to go to Bur'o, I was leaving and they did the same thing. And then they were like, see, and there's like, no, well, when I was traveling, and then there was like, and that is, and then obviously the interactions that you're having with just people in the streets, I was getting my set sorted out at the telesom at the theater, and then going in there, and then just people sitting outside recognize me and stuff was just wild. And then going to the culture center for the book fair, and then little kids coming up to me saying, "Oh, I recognize." I'm like, how do kids recognize me? I understand, maybe teenagers and adults and stuff, but like a kid that's under the age of 10, that is wild. So I think it made me realize that what I was doing was great to have, the Saqiriya Kabir, all of them just there supporting me and, really, really proud of what I'm doing and encouraging me and motivating me, and then obviously figureheads like Aidan, that those are people of a particular position, so seeing that is just, I mean, it's one thing when you see a politician saying, yeah, good job, what you're doing is great and stuff, but when it comes to like the regular folks, or when it comes to the people doing, real hard work on the ground, like Askar, protecting the people, Aidan and stuff, when they also, give you a hand of salute, that's different, that hits different. Does that make sense?
It sounds like you're so touched that you're literally speechless.
Yeah, 100%. I was genuinely
which is very rare
when I saw that. I was
like, but anywho, continue.
Yeah. But again, also, what you need to remember is they're very, critical. If someone, let's say a poet, and someone's a pretty good poet, they're still gonna find, and we saw that in Somalia, they're gonna find something in it. But I
think that's because that's also like, they are also, I think, okay, so I think it's twofold. Our people are very critical, but at the same time, they will claim you and wholeheartedly like claim you and represent you and act like they were riding with you since day one. It's kind of like you have to break through like they're going to criticize you along the way, but once you get to a point where you've done something and it's done well, they're going to be like, they're one of us. There, especially in Somaliland, like being back home, there is this innate, there is a lot of criticism all the time, but there's this innate way of saying you are one of us that after the abuse that I don't really understand, but it's always there, like it was very much like everybody doesn't get respect off rip. You have to earn the respect, so I think that there aren't like the acceptance or like, like that you get really is like unmatched to anything else. Other people will align with people for strategic reasons, but for us it's like, you are one of us. And it's always those little interactions like the ones that you mentioned with the askari or things like that really show how that's possible. Like people that you think wouldn't know you or care about you, or that you wouldn't have anything in common with. We really are coming from different worlds in a lot of ways, but when you find a space for that middle ground, that's when it's it's a bit sweeter.
100%. No, I agree 110%. Yeah, you encompass that really well.
But then for you, then you went after you did that, after you kind of dealt with that initial welcome, then you ended your trip with a screening of, was it just of the documentary, or like, so speak about that.
So it was absolutely wild. It wasn't something, honestly, that was expected. So when I went prior to going to Somaliland last year, I wanted to work on projects and stuff, but then I've been working on so many different things here that I thought, if I go there and I'm just working and trying to navigate Wadankhi that I've been away for 16 years, when do I actually relax? So then I changed my mind prior to going to just say, I'm just going to take this as a holiday. I'm not going to do any work. But people, when I was there, were expecting a screening, which made sense. So fast forward, maybe it was definitely my last week, I was put in contact with a man called Nasir. Shout out to Nasir, who is like founded. I believe he founded Funkin, and he wanted to show me the venue and the space and stuff. But again, there was no conversation about screening anything or anything like that. It was just seeing the space, getting to know the creative scene in Wadanki, and just getting to network with people, right? So I went to the space. It was great. Then I met Mustafa Saeed, who manages the space and is really doing an incredible job at Funkin. So he showed me the space, and then it just ended up a conversation of just being, well, why don't we screen the documentary here and do something here? And they were like, oh, 100%, that would be great. Let's do it. So then it ended up being 2 days prior to me leaving. So and then I was told something that I had no idea when it was necessary for events. I was told, well, Mustafa says to me, well, that's when do you have a FNN? And I was just like, we talk about FNN. No, we've got the screening, we'll do a Q&A, we'll just have a vibe, like, that's it. What else do we need? And he said, are you all right? Nobody's coming to know nothing without a FNN. And so I was like, this is mental. And so I met, so there was a guy that worked for Astan who reached out to me and said, he said he knew Roda Cave. And so I connected with him. So I reached out to her, and then she agreed to come. And then we put out the flyer. So once she agreed, we put out the flyer. And then I wasn't sure if people were going to really come out, because there was such a short period of time in terms of like advertisement. It was only 2 days. But then when we got to the day of the screening, the place was jam packed. There was people, they had nowhere to sit. So people were standing, some people were sitting on the walls, people were sitting on the stairs, people were just remained standing. It was really jam packed, and it was so impactful and powerful. And then we also had a poet there who's called Nether, and she recited a couple of poetry about Somaliland, and it was really powerful, and it really moved a lot of people, and it moved everyone that was there. And then of course Roda performed, incredible. And then we had the screen. Then we had the screening, and then then it followed by a Q&A. And then it was a beautiful way and an incredible way to end my trip in Somaliland.
Did people like say stuff to you, or like was there a Q&A? Was there a Q&A section during that event?
Yes. So I was asked, they have a mindset or an opinion that of us in the diaspora, especially say Walahis, that we're just Yaradisho or Yaradiman, and that. So I find that quite insulting. I like to think that I am not dish, so or that we
Oh my
that
god.
we as a collective are not. So they was asking me like, what do you think of that? And I was like, well, what kind of question is that? Like, that's an insult, kind of.
Wait,
So it's
they
just
asked you that?
yeah, they just like, people assume that. So what do you say to people that they have that opinion of them? And I was like, well, really, it's a testimony to their mindset to assume an entire population are all basically down. It's just a bit mad. And again, it just really speaks to the disconnect between the people in the diaspora and the people back home. And there's a lot of inferiority complexes and stuff like that goes on both ends of the spectrum. And that's, I think, something for a different episode to really dive into that.
We can absolutely have that conversation. I've been ready for that conversation since 2015.
Yeah, 100. I mean, we had that conversation on Twitter Space, because there was just so much tensions between us, and we had to just say, well, let's just lay it on the table, what's going on. And they pretty much admitted that they feel like we have all these different opportunities and stuff. And then it was they really were quite honest and stuff, and it was like, okay, cool, now we can work on being more collaborative and stuff. They just thought that we were after their jobs, and that sounds very, very right wing, but but that we were taking over their jobs, and that we feel like we know more than them, and that we think that we're better than them, and things like that. And
But they think we're dumb. So
yeah, and then they also think we're dumb, and so both of those things are very far from the truth, and it's just preconceived notions of one another basically, and it's about having that conversation. And I spoke about that when I was in Cardiff as well, and I spoke about that in Hargeysa, um, about having open dialogue and conversation and being collaborative. Without the diaspora, we wouldn't be here today. Without you guys, we wouldn't be here today. So why are we throwing rocks at each other? It just doesn't make any sense. And they were all in agreement with that. And this whole divisive, Kolkolchuk versus Korbachuk, and Korbachuk akafian Kolkolchuk, I'm Kolkolchuk akafian Korbachuk. It just what does that do? Because without us, you're not going to be able to function in so many different ways. And then without you guys, well, what are we coming to? Do you know what I mean? We're not going to be able to function there, So it's like we equally need each other. So let's stop throwing dirt and mud at each other and just work more collaboratively together. But yeah, long story short, it was an absolutely incredible evening.
Okay, so the reason I asked what they asked you was to kind of see like what things came up, because I think the one thing that is very different. So even the question about like where were you born, that type of thing, it's really challenging. The notion of who can be the storyteller,
Mm-hmm.
like it's not like you have to be somebody that was born and raised in that environment to accurately like talk about that environment. You have found your own ways to share that story.
Well, that was asked. That was a
And
question that they definitely asked. And when I said I was born in, because again, obviously the conversation is happening in Somali. So when I answered that and said I was born in the UK, I was born in a city called Sheffield, and I haven't been here for 16 years, and I've only been here twice prior to this trip, and I was only here for the summer holidays, so I was only here for like a couple of months as a kid. It wasn't like a long period of time or anything like that. And as a kid, I already knew how to speak fluent Somali when I came. And they were genuinely shocked. There's people noticed what my cousins were telling me after they said he's lying. They were like, there's people that are speaking on the stage that were born here and left here as adults are coming back talking like quote unquote, say what lies. But this kid this guy who's, born and raised over there, hasn't been here for 16 years and, was only here as a kid for a couple of months, is speaking like this is insane. And then also is so connected to Somaliland and is doing documentaries about Somaliland. So those were definitely the conversations that came up, and they were talking about what made me want to create this documentary. I was born and raised in the West, so what motivated me in wanting to be so connected, or what made me so connected to Somaliland. So there was definitely the conversations that we also had during that evening, during the Q&A.
Like we kind of went through the timeline of your documentary, but then also you mentioned you submitted it to certain platforms, but then speak about then the BFI and then how that all kind of played out, and what the BFI is for the non-British audience.
Yeah, so the BFI is the British Film Institute. It's, I would say, it's like Cannes, and it's like the Toronto Film Festival, with a but then there's people that may not be familiar with that, so just the
An
Hollywood
international
of
film
the
festival,
UK, basically. Yeah, it's an international film festival that's really, really prestigious, basically. And we submitted it, and we didn't know if it was going to be accepted or anything like that. We knew that it was great and that they would be insane to reject it. But we again weren't sure because there was thousands and thousands and thousands of people who submitted it from across the world. It wasn't just specific to London, it was global. So it was international films that were being submitted as well. So it was very, very competitive. And I think they ended up only selecting, I think it was 10 or 11, something like that, films. And my documentary was one of them. It's a documentary that's called Somaliland Ha Nolato, Long Live Somaliland. And just seeing or getting the email where they said, congratulations, we've accepted your submission and we want to screen your documentary for the festival, was alone was just absolutely wild and insane. And that's when I was like, I freaking made it. I did. So so yeah, honestly, that was incredible because it's really difficult to get into the BFI. So that was really rewarding. And then seeing my face on an IMAX cinema, just me just talking about Somaliland, and then seeing the flag, and then seeing our people, seeing the country, talking about the struggle, and once, and that was the only documentary that was screened or any film that was screened where and there was about 700 people in this cinema, because it's a huge cinema, and almost everybody that was in that room stood up and gave a round of applause when that documentary ended. No other film got that, and that to me really gave me a lot of motivation to continue, because I'm really on the right track and I'm doing something that is important work. But any self-doubt that I had went straight out of the window. Now, that doesn't mean that it was, I got this inflated ego and, I felt like, oh, no one can tell me nothing. And no, not at all. But because you're always going to watch something back and say, oh, I wish I changed this, or I should have added this. You always, especially with me, because I'm a perfectionist as well. So I'm never that satisfied, to be fair. We've got to work on that, though, innit? Yeah, no, definitely got to work on that. But that was, a Somaliland film, documentary, whatever it may be, has never been screened. And I don't think a Somali film in general, I'm pretty sure there was no Somali film, full stop, that was screened at the BFI at that point. I think that one might have been the first. So that alone is just insane. But at the same time, what is so funny is I think that there's so many different things that I've done, and I just think that it's not like, I don't know, I feel like I've done it, so it's like, oh, I've done it, so it's actually really doable. So why isn't everybody else doing it? Does that make sense? Whereas
Yeah.
you would see somebody else doing it, and you're like, oh, that's absolutely incredible. You're like, whoa, that's really impressive. And people will like make it go big, and they'll be like, oh my days. People would really like uplift that and go crazy over it. But when I do it, I kind of just look at it and I'm just like, okay, kind of thing. As impressed as
About
I
what?
am, and as
About what? About what
where
you
I'm
did,
just
about others?
no, like for instance, when there's a film that, let's say there's another documentary about Somaliland that goes through to the BFI, or goes to TIFF or something, I'd be like, oh, that's absolutely incredible. In Tasokata, I'm gonna like post it everywhere. I'm gonna go rave about it, congratulate the director and the entire crew, and I would see that as really incredible. And as would so many people, and so many people obviously did see that as incredible, because that's exactly what I did. But for me, I look at that and I'm like, well, if I can do it, why ain't you doing it? You can do it too. You can. Do you know what I mean? So it's just like,
Yeah.
oh, it's actually really doable type of thing. But which in a way, which is obviously great to think that, but also at the same time, it makes me, I always, and I had this conversation with Haley, who I did the documentary with. We both actually are similar in that way, where we don't sit down and actually bask in
Deep what you
what we've
do.
just done. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I still really haven't. But then there's moments, trust me, where you realize real quick when someone tries to act up. Basically, you're like, hold on, do you know?
Oh my
You know,
god.
do you know what I mean? But
You
not in
guys
that
are
sense,
all
but
seeing a sense
in
of who Kasim is, guys.
no, in the right context. In the right context, I'm talking about in general, but I'm talking about in specific context.
I know
Because as a
exactly
young
what you're
person,
talking about.
yeah, no, because as a young person, but the viewers may not understand, or the
Yes.
listeners may
Okay.
not
Please.
understand. But
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
I'm
Go.
saying,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll elaborate a little bit. When you're a young person in certain spaces, people will try to undermine you because you're young, right? They'll just be like, "What do you know?" and stuff. Then you realize, and then that's when you say, "Well, hold on. Yeah, I'm young, but I've done this, 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 and you haven't." Not saying that that's a bad thing that you haven't, but it's something that you would want yourself to be able to accomplish, right? So that's when sometimes you would think to yourself, well, who are you talking to? Like, that's when for me anyway, where I would remember actually you accomplished some really impressive things. Whereas outside of those circumstances, which alhamdulillah isn't often, like outside of those circumstances, I do just think they sit there and just be like, okay, what's the next thing? I need to do something else, and I move on to the next thing. Even with this documentary, I'm like already having conversations for the next project. I've just had a conversation yesterday about the next project. This current project hasn't actually had its official premiere. Yeah, you know what I mean. So
Yeah.
I do need to just chill out for a second and just really learn how to bask in accomplishments and celebrate it.
Yes. Because I think also the first one, even the fashion film, I just keep talking about that because it's such an interesting way of presenting information and also like creating your own lane to culture, that I think that a lot of times, especially being younger, and if you are also coming from like the diaspora angle, and engaging with like back home, you feel like there is a sense of just wanting to learn how things are done, and then like people adapt to try to adapt. And I think that we're all not supposed to be the same, like as people in general, but also like the fact that we have all these different life experiences and grew up in different contexts. Like there's so many different ways that we could add on to what these different identities, like these ethnic identities, cultural expression could look like. And I think it's always so limiting when people go back and they're just like playing by the same rules that exists obviously on a social level, but when it comes to like creative expression, we need, like, that's what's going to allow us to evolve and, you know, like grow as a society.
Yeah, no, 100%. You know, it's interesting. You've mentioned that you keep referring back to the fashion film, but you're not alone in that. A lot of people have resonated with that. Often the one that people really do mention is that fashion film where they always say, oh, you know, your fashion film, the one that you did. That's the one that I think most people have seen. And that's the one that probably they've resonated with the most because it's not been done in that way before. And so, yeah, that's definitely one that they resonate with for sure. And again, it's fun. I was just gonna add this last little bit where it's interesting because where people that, like, you've seen weddings that happen in Hargeysa, they are fly. Do you know what I mean? So fashion goes hand in hand with Somalilanders. Everything is coordinated. Everything makes sense. Everything, they just always fly. So, and then with my parents, they've always, you know, dressed to the nines. You know, they always knew how to dress. So all of that just made absolute sense. So I think maybe one of the reasons why they also resonate is like, oh, finally we are seen for being fly people.
And I think it's yeah, because I think a lot of times, even when you see like on TikTok, like how the younger generation is connecting to Somali culture, what I think is really interesting with Gen Z is that it's always like the girls, when they wear a direct, it's like for the culture. Like there is never a direct that is posted without the full drip, right? Like it's always the daheb and everything, the full direct set, the garbasat, everything, and it's a for the culture. So I hope you all enjoyed this first part of this conversation with Kasim, really talking about his journey into becoming a documentary filmmaker and what that process looked like of putting together and screening his first documentary, Somaliland Ha Nolato. So in the second episode, part 2, we'll talk more about the second documentary, Untold Stories, East End Somalilanders, screening that at London Somali Week and how that experience was overall. Stay tuned for the next episode.
Kala naqrono meel wana